Warning: the following podcast may discuss topics of violence that may not be suitable for all ages. Listener discretion is advised. Hello, and welcome back to Above and Beyond. As always, I'm your host, Philip Kesterson, and tonight I have a great episode lined up for you guys. But before we get into that, I would like to announce that I plan to do a Q&A episode within the next few weeks. The structure of the episode will be determined solely based on the number of questions that I get, but the gist of it is that you, the listener, can email the show or you can message the Facebook page a question you have about history, and I will do my best to answer them. The questions do not have to be specific to a time period, but they need to try to be at least military or general history related. To submit your question, you can email the show at above.beyondpodcast@gmail.com, or you can message the show directly on the Facebook page. Also, if you would like for me to shout out your name, you can include it along with the question. But if you do not specify whether or not you would like to remain anonymous, I will default to just leaving your name out. And honestly, I'm kind of excited to do that episode because it may or may not be filmed, so we'll just see how it goes. So let's just get into tonight's episode. This is episode 8, and tonight we are covering Raul, Perez, Roy Benavidez. Now, Roy Benavidez was born on August 5th, 1935, in a small town called Cuero, Texas, to father Salvador and his mother Teresa Perez. Now, growing up, he had a rough childhood. His father died of tuberculosis when he was about 2 years old, and then when he was 7, his mother also passed from tuberculosis. Because he had no living relatives that were close by, his aunt and uncle took him and his younger brother to El Campo, Texas, which is about an hour southwest of Houston. Here, he had to work all kinds of odd jobs, from shining shoes at the local bus station, to picking cotton on farms, to working in a tire shop. And at just 15 years old, he dropped out of school to work full-time and support his family. He would later go on to say that this was the dumbest thing he ever did in his entire life, and he would become an advocate for kids staying in school. He always said that one of the most important things that someone should do is get their diploma because they can't really do anything without it. In 1952, at the age of 17, he would enlist in the Texas National Guard, and in June of 1955, he would switch to active duty to serve in the Korean War. By 1960, he had successfully completed airborne training and was put in the 82nd Airborne Division and stationed at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. Now, while he was in North Carolina, he learned about special forces, and it was something that he was incredibly interested in. That he'd heard small things about it when he was younger, but he never knew the full on what they were about and everything. But when he was at Fort Bragg, like I said, he learned a lot about it, and it interested him, so he tried to join it. And not only was he accepted pretty quickly, but more importantly, he qualified. And after successfully completing the training, he was assigned to the 5th Special Forces Group, and later put in the Studies and Observation Group, or better known as just SOG. Now, while he did serve in the Korean War, what earned him a spot on the show tonight was actually what he did on the night of May 2nd, 1968 during the Vietnam War. But of course, like every other episode, before we get into exactly what he did, we have to set some kind of groundwork. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Vietnam War. Now, following the end of World War II in 1945, communism began growing more and more. The world was no longer focused on a conflict between the Axis and the Allies, but now the world was focused on communism versus not communism. When Germany lost the war, the capital, Berlin, was split evenly amongst the communist East and the non-communist West. The East was controlled by the USSR, and therefore communism, like I said, and the West was controlled by a combination of American, British, and French forces. Tensions between the two sides, they were always heated. There were always some kind of... Easterners were always trying to get to the West, and it resulted in sometimes they would get shot, they would get jailed, and it was just a horrible situation to be in. When the city was split in two, there were actually some buildings that were right on the line between East and West. So some Easterners were going into these buildings and like jumping out the windows to the west side. And there's a lot of cool, well, quote unquote cool footage of some Easterners trying to climb out of these windows to the west, and then there's like Western or Eastern guards that are stopping them. And eventually, these buildings would be completely bricked up and then later torn down. When I think in 1961, the Berlin Wall was officially like started construction, and it's like permanently set a literal wall between the East and the West, and that would go on to not be torn down until the late 80s. Now in Europe, communism was being stopped in Berlin and not really going any further west, but it was still rapidly spreading across Asia, specifically Southeast Asia, which is where Vietnam is. The spread of communism scared a lot of Western countries, but specifically, it terrified the United States because they saw it as a crime against democracy. Sometime in the late 1940s, I want to say specifically it was 1949, that this theory was come up with. The U.S. President, Harry Truman, came up with this geopolitical idea called the domino theory. And basically what it was it said that if one country fell to communism, then its neighbors will, and their neighbors will, and so on and so forth. Tensions between the U.S. and the USSR were incredibly heated, but in 1945, in August of 1945, the United States displayed a power that no one had ever seen, and thankfully no one has really seen since, when they dropped 2 atomic bombs on the nation of Japan, ending World War II in the Pacific theater. Now, there's a lot of controversy behind why these bombs were dropped that I'm not going to necessarily get into this episode because it's not relevant to the story. But a few years later, in August of 1949, the USSR detonated their first bomb. So now we have 2 world powers. They both have these atomic weapons, and basically the world is just at a standstill with the 2 of them. Neither side wanted a war as they feared that it would lead to global destruction. So we have this Cold War. And there was this Cold War basically lasted from 1945 until 1991 when the Soviet Union officially collapsed. Talking about Vietnam specifically, it was held by France at this time. It defended it very successfully against Japan during World War II. Japan kept trying to invade, but a combination of Vietnamese forces and French forces were always holding them off. But around this time, in 1945, when the war ended, there was a Vietnamese man named Ho Chi Minh who wanted to lead his people to independence. And after about 50 years or so of being under French occupation, the Vietnamese people in general wanted independence, and they sought to gain it. Now, following the end of World War II and up until about 10 years later, Vietnamese forces under Ho Chi Minh and the French were constantly fighting. The French suffered a decisive defeat after a 57-day siege at Dien Bien Phu in 1945, and they officially would pull out of Vietnam after this. Like, it was just such a huge defeat for them that they realized that they could not hold the country anymore. In 1954, at the Geneva Conference, a treaty would be signed between the French and the Vietnamese that would officially split the country at the 17th parallel, with the communists in control of the north and the democrats in control of the south. Around this time, and with the idea of the domino theory playing a vital role, the United States unofficially began supporting the South Vietnamese government, and the Soviets around this time also started supporting the North Vietnamese government. Both countries supplied their respective sides with military advisors. They would give them training, like military training, and they would give them weapons. But they would not necessarily fight because they wanted to avoid a major conflict. And essentially what happened in Vietnam was it became a proxy war for about 10 years or so. Fast forward to 1963, and 2 U.S. destroyers are sunk by North Vietnamese torpedoes in the Gulf of Tonkin. Now, when this happened, it led to the creation of something called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which allowed President at the time, Lyndon B. Johnson, it gave him the authority to make war plans for Vietnam. And within the next year, Johnson began regular bombing raids in North Vietnam under Operation Rolling Thunder, and began putting U.S. boots on the ground. Now, for the United States, the Vietnam War had officially begun. So that's kind of the basic setup for why this conflict is happening. So now we're going to talk about Benavidez and what he did specifically in Vietnam. But before we do that, we're going to pause for a word from our sponsor. So in 1965, the first U.S. troops were officially starting to be put in Vietnam, and Roy Benavidez was among some of the first. He was sent to South Vietnam as an advisor for their military commanders. Unfortunately, during one of his very, very first patrols, he would step on a landmine, and it severely impacted his spine. He was pulled out, he was evacuated, and he was sent to a hospital in Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas. And here, he was told that he would never walk again. But basically, he just said that that dog wasn't going to hunt. And because he just straight refused the diagnosis, which is badass in and of itself. Like, they told him, your spine's too bad. You're never going to have the use of your legs again. And he said, I'm okay. I'm going to walk again. And they were like, all right, whatever. So he refused this diagnosis. And he really hated that around this time, even before the war had officially began, there were a lot of anti-war protests happening. I'm going to talk about this for a second. Vietnam War is, without a doubt, the most unpopular war in American history. And personally, I believe it has something to do with the fact that this war was the first that was televised on a wide scale. Like, there were reporters that were always in Vietnam interviewing soldiers, showing like the Vietnamese people, and people started to quote unquote humanize the enemies. You see this actually happened during the Civil War too. Like the Battle of Antietam in 1862. This was the first battle that was like photographed in American history. And when people saw these pictures in the paper, they started to see how serious that this was. And a lot of the times, Union commanders, they weren't just battling the Confederates, they were also battling the newspapers. So now fast forward to Vietnam, and it's kind of the same thing. These U.S. troops, they're not just battling the North Vietnamese, they are also battling these journalists who are shaping the war however they want. And I believe that this played a large part in it. And anti-war protests were popular all over the country. But Benavidez, he hated this because he knew that his men were just going over there to do what they were told. He knew that he was going over there to do what they told, and he just didn't agree with the anti-war protest. He didn't necessarily support the war per se, but he also was not against it because, as I said, he understands that he is just doing his job. Now, against the wishes of his doctors, Benavidez underwent his own method to try and walk again, and how he would do this was secretly, every single night, he would use his elbows and his chin because, again, he did not have the use of his legs this time. He would use his elbows and his chin to drag himself to a wall, and then he would pull himself up and he would hold himself there every single night while he practiced moving his toes, his feet, and his legs. And now this had to be incredibly painful for him. I heard an interview from him where he talked about this was worse than actually stepping on the landmine, was trying to move his feet and stuff like this. But he went through it, and after about a year of doing this, a doctor reportedly was going to serve him with his medical discharge papers, and he presented him with it, but he had heard what he had been doing every night, so he basically told him, he was like, Roy, if you walk out of this room right now, I will take these papers and I will tear them up. And Roy stood up out of his chair, and he slowly walked out of the room. So the doctor took the discharge papers and ripped them in half. After this was in July of 1966. After this, he would return to Vietnam in January of 1968. Now, this is where we're going to talk about the most important night in Roy Benavidez's life. So after only about 4 months back in country, now this is May 2nd of 1968, he would later call this 6 hours in hell. And that's exactly what this was. Like, when I read this story, my mouth was just open the entire time. I could not believe what this man did. So it was on this night that, at the time, Staff Sergeant Roy Benavidez overheard a radio call of a 12-man Special Forces patrol that had come under assault by an entire enemy battalion. And knowing that his men were trapped and that they were pretty much surrounded and that they were most likely going to be annihilated, he voluntarily grabbed a bag of medical supplies and he jumped aboard one of the helicopters that were going to attempt a rescue for the overrun troops. In one of the interviews later, he talked about how when he ran over to this helicopter, there was the door gunner was lumped over his machine gun, like the door gun, and he grabbed him and he held him, and he said that the kid was 19 years old, and he said this kid looked at him and he said something along the lines of, "My God, my mother and father," and those were his last words. And now this impacted him, Benavidez, a lot. And this was kind of one of the motivations where he was like, I have to go help these men. He's like, if it costs me my life, that's fine, but I have to do something. So the helicopters took off, and as they were coming into the LZ, they entered under heavy small arms fire. And Benavidez, he grabbed his knife, he grabbed this bag of medical supplies, and he jumped out of the helicopter while it was still about 10 feet off the ground. And he ran to assist the men. Now, while he is running to them, he is shot 3 times. He is shot once through his right leg, he is shot through his face, and he had a bullet go through the back of his head. But he's like, I don't care, and he just keeps going. So that alone is pretty cool. While he was here, he had also learned that the leader of the Special Forces unit that was out there, he had some incredibly important documents on him. So he was like, I have to find this guy, I have to get these documents. So he come across the body of the squad leader who sadly had been killed. But while he is trying to get these documents, he is shot 2 more times, once through his chest, once through his stomach, and then he had a grenade blow up directly behind him. So now on top of the bullet in his leg, his face, his head, 2 in his abdomen, his entire back is now covered in grenade shrapnel. It completely ripped open his backpack. It cut off half of his belt. It was just, he wasn't stopping. He had a mission. He knew what he had to do. So he just kept going. So he gets the documents. And he starts, around the same time that this happens, the helicopter, when it was hovering, the pilot was shot a few times and it killed him. And the helicopter crashed. So this helicopter that had all these troops that Benavidez had just put on there, it has now crashed. So he's like, shit, like what do I do now? So in true badass form, he runs over to them, he starts dragging them back out of the helicopter, and he sets up a defensive perimeter, and he basically says, this is going to be our last stand. He is running from man to man, he is giving them ammo, he's giving them water. At one point, while he was administering first aid, a North Vietnamese soldier came up and stabbed him in the back. And he pulled this knife out, pulled out his own, and then stabbed the North Vietnamese soldier and killed him. Now, at this time, of the original 12-man force, there's only about 8 that are still alive, but there's only about 2 or 3 that are able to still continue fighting. Benavidez is among one of them that are still able to fight. So he is convinced that this is just where he's going to die, and he feels like he's going to die with these men. But at like the last possible minute, a helicopter starts coming in, and he's like, oh, thank God. So he starts loading men on there, and he is grabbing everybody. He's making sure that nobody gets left behind. So he's putting them in the helicopter, and as he is walking to the helicopter, he gets tackled by another Vietnamese soldier. This guy bayoneted him 2 more times. 2 more times he is stabbed, and took his rifle and slaps him across the face with it and gives him lockjaw. Like, it almost shatters his jaw completely. But Benavidez kills this guy too. And then when he is 100% sure that there is no more of his troops on the ground, he's like, we're done here, and he gets on the helicopter. As he's climbing on the helicopter, the door gunner is shooting out one of the sides of the helicopter, and he looks to the left. Benavidez looks to the left, and he sees 2 North Vietnamese soldiers running at the helicopter, and it's at an angle that the door gunner really can't get to. So he pulls the sidearm of this door gunner, and he shoots these 2 North Vietnamese soldiers before they get to the helicopter, and then they take off. So this is just a crazy night. Like, he has been shot, he's been blown up, he's been stabbed, he's had his jaw shattered. It's insane. Like, a normal person would just collapse under all this, but he just does not quit. Like, this is the type of guy that the boogeyman has in his closet, you know? Like, he's just a badass. So now the helicopters are returning back to base. Roy Benavidez is aboard them, and they're coming back in. But I am not going to tell you what happens next. What I'm going to do is let the man himself, Roy Benavidez, tell you the story. What you are about to hear is an audio clip from 1991 where Roy Benavidez tells the story of what happened that night. This is just a small portion of it because honestly it's kind of funny, and I would rather you hear it from his voice than you do from my voice.
I was hitting him out with the butt of the weapon. My jaws were locked. After my last return back to the helicopter, when I was boarded on, I was holding my intestines in my hand. We lifted up. The helicopter had over its payload. Blood was flowing on both sides of the helicopter. When we landed, it locked me in our staging area, and it started unloading. It started identifying the bodies. They found out I loaded 3 dead enemy soldiers in that helicopter. I didn't want to leave anybody behind. My mission was to recover the classified material, so if anybody had it, he was on the helicopter. So they let the 3 enemy soldiers on the side, and because I sort of look Oriental, they thought I was one of them, so they let me lay right next to them. And they were putting us in body bags. And I remember that my feet had been lifted, and I was inserted into the body bag, and I could hear that zipper coming up, and I thought, oh my God, no. My eyes were shut because I had blood all over my face, my eyes, and the blood had dried up in my eyelids. And I couldn't talk because my jaws were locked, and I could hear that zipper coming up, and one of my buddies was doing the Mexican head dance, and he was yelling at the doctor, that's Roy Benavidez. The doctor said, sorry, there's nothing I can do for him. Oh my God, and the zipper just coming up. I was trying to wiggle in my own blood, and finally, I'll find out later, Jerry Cottenham made that doctor at least to feel my heartbeat. When I felt that hand on my chest, I made the luckiest shot I ever made in my life. I spit in the doctor's face.
Now, what a guy, right? Like, to go on this helicopter, to have them presume that you're dead, and then as they're zipping you up in the body bag, he spits in the doctor's face just to be like, hey, I'm still alive. Like, imagine the shock on that doctor's face. Like, it's insane. What a guy. You know, for this night, he was actually only initially given the Distinguished Service Cross, which is insane. Like, if this doesn't give you the Medal of Honor, what does? You know, in 1973, the Special Forces Lieutenant Colonel Ralph R. Drake, he tried to have it upgraded to the Medal of Honor, but the Army Decorations Board said that they could not give him the Medal of Honor because there were no living witnesses to corroborate the story. Now, both Drake and Benavidez believed this to be true because they didn't think that anybody from that night had survived. Because for the most part, a lot of them didn't. Like I said, he is credited with saving about 8 men's life from that night, but of those 8, they didn't all survive. However, now this is like, what are the odds? In 1980, a man by the name of Brian O'Connor was in Australia on vacation at the time. Now, the reason this is important is because he just happened to be at a newspaper stand that was giving international newspapers. And he saw one from El Campo, Texas. Like, this small town in Texas just happened to have a newspaper at this international stand in Australia. And what caught his attention was he saw Roy Benavidez's face on the front of it. And he opened it and he was reading the story. And he saw that they were wanting to give him the Medal of Honor, but they couldn't because they had no living witnesses. Now, the significance of this man is that he was a radio operator who just happened to be with Benavidez that night, and he was one of the only survivors. He had been gravely wounded that night, and he had been transporting out and taken back to the States before anybody knew what happened to him, and he was never properly debriefed. So he couldn't tell what exactly happened, and Benavidez just expected him to have died, which, real quick, that's kind of a sad thing of war, and a lot with, like, Vietnam and stuff like that, was this stuff would happen, and then your guys would be transported off, and you would never know, because, I mean, there weren't cell phones, there wasn't the internet, you would never know what happened to these guys after they left. But that's exactly what happened. Like, Benavidez thought that he was killed, but when O'Connor read this article, he contacted Benavidez and then submitted a 10-page report explaining what happened that night, confirming everything that happened, and they were blown away. Like, Benavidez and Drake and the Army Decoration Board, they were all kind of blown away that this man seemingly come back from the dead and was like, yeah, no, everything that happened, it happened. Like, I was there, I saw it. And on February 24th, 1981, almost 10 years after the war had ended, and about 14 years after the actual night happened, President Ronald Reagan upgraded to the Distinguished Service Cross to the Medal of Honor. That clip you heard a minute ago was actually from, like I said, a 1991 ceremony. It was like the 10-year anniversary of him getting the Medal of Honor, and he was telling that story again. I will put a link to that full interview or that full thing in the comments below and on the Facebook page if you would like to check it out, because honestly, it's cool to hear him talk about that night and talk about everything, and it's refreshing to hear stuff like that directly from the words or from the mouth of the man who went through it. When I do this show, one of the first things I always do is if it happens within like the last 50 years or so, I always try to see if I could find an interview, and this was like the first one. I mean, a couple episodes, or last episode actually, with the Gorkhas, Diprasad Poon, he did have an interview, but it was in his native language, and I couldn't accurately translate it. So when I come across this one, I thought it was kind of cool, and I wanted to include it. So like I said, in 1981, his Distinguished Service Cross was upgraded to the Medal of Honor by President Ronald Reagan. And Reagan would go on to say to the press, quote, "If the story of his heroism were a movie script, you would not believe it," end quote. And that is true, because when I first read the story and I read the citation for his Medal of Honor, I was like, there's no way. Like, there's no way this happened. But, I mean, it happened. It's true. After the war, now Master Sergeant Roy Benavidez devoted most of his time to relaying to kids the importance of staying in school, and he became a serious advocate for veterans with disabilities. He spoke to armed forces, he spoke to schools, civic groups, and businesses all over the world. He traveled to Greece, Panama, Korea, Japan, just basically telling his story and, like I said, the importance of staying in school. He even went on to publish 3 separate autobiographies, 2 about the incident that night, or no, 1 about that incident that night, 1 about his experiences in Vietnam as a whole, and then 1 about how it was growing up like a poor farm boy, basically. Now, sadly, all stories do need to come to an end. And on November 29th, 1998, at the age of 63, Roy Benavidez passed away from respiratory failure and complications from diabetes, and he is now buried at Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery in San Antonio, Texas. In all, that night he suffered at least 7 gunshot wounds, 2 or 3 separate stabs from bayonets, 2 separate grenade blasts, and being struck multiple times in the face by a rifle. That's enough to bring down like a horse. And this man was having absolutely none of it because, like I said, he had a mission and damn it, he was going to do it. So, including the Medal of Honor, he personally received 16 individual medals, 8 separate badges, 2 unit citations, and a Texas State Award, and he has a vehicle cargo ship in the U.S. Navy called the USNS Benavidez named after him. So it's a living legacy that whoever's on that ship or whoever's in the Navy or anybody in San Antonio, they probably know this guy. It's an incredible story. It's something that more people need to be like. I mean, wars don't need to happen. Like, I'm a very strong advocate that wars do not need to happen, but I understand that they do happen and that they will always happen. So as long as we have guys like Roy Benavidez fighting on our side, we'll be fine. I think we'll be fine. But that is going to do it for this episode. Thank you all for sticking around to the end. If you would like to, again, like I said, next couple of weeks I will be doing a question and answers episode. If you would like to submit your question, you can email me at above.beyondpodcast@gmail.com. You can even just email me if you want to say something about the show. If you want to suggest somebody in the future you would like me to cover, you can also email me or message me on the Facebook page. Yeah, you can find us on all social media. We're on Facebook, YouTube, go to Anchor, Spotify. We are now on Apple Podcasts, so if you would be so kind to rate, review the show, and share it among your friends. And as always, thank you for listening, and I will see you next week on Above and Beyond.